Three 8-year-old boys went out to ride their bikes on a spring afternoon in 1993. They never came home. Their bodies were found the next morning in a drainage ditch, bound, mutilated, and submerged in muddy water. The town of West Memphis, Arkansas was shattered. Police needed answers. They needed a killer. And within weeks, they had 3 suspects, 3 teenagers, kids who listened to heavy metal music and wore black clothing, kids who, in the eyes of the community, seemed different. No physical evidence linked them to the crime. No murder weapon was ever found. One of the confessions was given by a boy with an IQ of 72 after hours of interrogation without a lawyer present. But none of that mattered, because in 1994, all 3 were convicted. One was sentenced to death. They would spend the next 18 years behind bars. May 5th, 1993. West Memphis, Arkansas, a small working-class town just across the Mississippi River from Memphis, Tennessee. Population, around 28,000 people. 3 second graders, Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, all 8 years old, left their homes that afternoon to ride bikes in the neighborhood. When they didn't return by dinner, their parents began to panic. Police searched through the night. The next morning, May 6th, a sergeant spotted something in a muddy drainage ditch in a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. It was a child's shoe. What they found next would traumatize everyone who was there. All 3 boys were found submerged in the water, their hands bound behind their backs with their own shoelaces. They had been beaten. Christopher Byers had suffered the most severe injuries. The medical examiner would later determine the injuries were consistent with animal predation, something that would become critical years later. But in 1993, investigators immediately suspected a ritualistic, cult-style killing. The satanic panic of the 1980s had swept across America. Parents were terrified of secret cults. Churches were warning their congregations. And law enforcement had been trained to see the signs of occult activity, even when those signs weren't really there. Police quickly focused their investigation on 3 teenagers from the area. Damien Echols was 18 years old. He was quiet, intense, and interested in Wicca, a nature-based religion that had nothing to do with devil worship, but that many in the community didn't understand. He wore black. He read Stephen King. He was different. Jason Baldwin was 16. He was Damien's best friend, shy, artistic, and devoted to heavy metal music. He came from a poor family and had no prior criminal record. Jessie Misskelley Jr. was 17. He had an IQ of 72, putting him in the range of mild intellectual disability. He was not particularly close to Damien or Jason. On June 3rd, 1993, less than a month after the murders, Jessie was brought in for questioning. He was interrogated for approximately 12 hours. No parent, no lawyer. For most of that time, the recording was not running. What exists on tape is less than 3 hours of that interrogation. And in those recordings, Jessie is clearly confused. He gets basic facts wrong: the time of day the murders occurred, how the boys were tied up, where exactly they were found. Investigators corrected him repeatedly. But at the end of that session, Jessie signed a confession. He said Damien had organized a satanic ritual, that the 3 of them had attacked and killed the boys in the woods. He would later recant entirely, saying police had fed him the details and pressured him into signing. Jessie was tried separately. His confession, coerced and factually inconsistent as it was used to convict him. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 2 20-year terms. Damien and Jason were tried together in early 1994. The trial was a spectacle. The prosecution brought in an occult expert, a mall cop with no formal credentials, who testified that the murders bore the hallmarks of satanic ritual. They introduced Damien's diary entries, his taste in music, the fact that he had read books about witchcraft. A former classmate testified, falsely it would later be shown, that Damien had bragged about the killings. What was almost entirely absent from the trial was actual physical evidence. No DNA, no murder weapon, no forensic evidence placing any of the 3 boys at the crime scene. The jury convicted both Damien and Jason. Jason was sentenced to life without parole. Damien Echols, just 19 years old, was sentenced to death by lethal injection. 3 teenagers, convicted on the basis of a coerced confession and cultural fear. And they would wait for years on the hope that someone would eventually listen. Damien Echols sat on death row at the Tucker Maximum Security Unit in Arkansas. He spent years in a cell roughly the size of a bathroom. He was allowed outside for 1 hour per day, alone. But something remarkable began to happen on the outside. In 1996, filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky released a documentary called Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. It aired on HBO and showed the world the trial, the lack of evidence, the circus atmosphere, the terrified teenagers. The public was horrified. Support groups formed. Celebrities got involved. Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, Johnny Depp, and many others began raising money and awareness. The West Memphis Three became a cause. Legal teams worked for years filing appeals. Each one was denied. The Arkansas court system refused to reopen the case. Then came the DNA. In 2007, new forensic testing was conducted on evidence from the crime scene. The results were stunning. No DNA from Damien, Jason, or Jessie was found anywhere. But a hair, found in one of the knots used to bind the boys, was matched to Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Steve Branch. Terry Hobbs, a man who had been present at vigils, who had spoken to the media, who had lived his life free while Damien Echols sat on death row waiting to be executed. A second hair found at the scene was matched to a friend of Hobbs named David Jacoby. Hobbs was also identified by a witness who said he had seen him with the 3 boys on the evening they disappeared, something Hobbs had never mentioned. Bite mark evidence was also re-examined. The wounds on the boys that had been attributed to a knife, wounds that prosecutors had claimed were evidence of ritualistic mutilation, were reanalyzed by a forensic odontologist. His conclusion: they were consistent with snapping turtle bites, post-mortem animal activity. Not a knife, not a ritual. The entire foundation of the prosecution's case was collapsing, and yet Arkansas still refused to free them. In August 2011, a deal was offered. The state of Arkansas would release all 3 men, but only if they entered what is known as an Alford plea. Under an Alford plea, a defendant pleads guilty while simultaneously maintaining their innocence. They acknowledge that the state has enough evidence to potentially convict them, but they do not admit to the crime. For the state, it was a way out. They could release the 3 men without admitting their system had failed, without compensating the men for nearly 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment, without prosecuting the real killer. For Damien, Jason, and Jessie, it was an impossible choice. Accept the deal and walk free, but as convicted killers in the eyes of the law, or continue fighting from prison with no guarantee of success. They took the deal. On August 19, 2011, all three men walked out of prison. Damien Echols had spent 18 years on death row. Jason Baldwin had entered prison as a 16-year-old boy. Jessie Misskelley had been behind bars since he was a teenager. They were free. But they were not exonerated. Today, Damien Echols lives in New York. He is a published author, an artist, and an advocate for criminal justice reform. He married his wife, Lori Davis, a woman who fell in love with him through letters while he was on death row. While he was still in prison, Jason Baldwin became a paralegal and has dedicated his life to helping others who have been wrongfully convicted. Jessie Misskelley returned to Arkansas and has kept largely out of the public eye. Terry Hobbs has never been charged with any crime related to the murders. He has denied all involvement. No one else has ever been arrested or prosecuted for the killings of Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. The three boys who died in Robin Hood Hills in 1993 have never received justice. And that is perhaps the most painful part of this entire story. 3 innocent men lost nearly 2 decades of their lives. And 3 murdered children, the actual victims, are still waiting for the truth. The case of the West Memphis Three exposes something deeply uncomfortable about the justice system. It shows how fear of the unknown, of difference, of things we don't understand, can override evidence, override reason, and destroy innocent lives. It shows how a coerced confession from a vulnerable teenager can send 3 people to prison. How cultural panic can replace forensic science in a courtroom. And how a system that refuses to admit its mistakes will protect itself at the cost of truth. If you made it this far, thank you. Thank you for watching. Cases like this one deserve to be remembered, talked about, and shared, because the more people know about how justice can fail, the harder it becomes for the system to hide those failures. Drop a comment below. Do you think Terry Hobbs was responsible? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There are plenty more cases that the world needs to hear about.